Welcome everyone to this meeting. I'm Vanessa Maidu, Communications and Knowledge Exchange Specialist for SEBI Livestock, the Center for Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions in Livestock, which facilitates the Livestock Data for Decisions Community of Practice, that's LD for D. Before we get started, if you can rename yourself with your full first and last name and organization in Zoom so we know who you are. To do this, open the participants list, hover over your name and click more. You can have your video on or off, it's your choice, but we'd love to see you. We will keep you on mute until discussions begin. And as always, you can use the chat anytime for questions and comments. Today's session is the very last session of our annual community meeting that has been taking place all week. We have had a very exciting program of webinars and workshops on livestock data topics, including environment, ontologies, economic analysis, and gender. If you want to find out about the community and future events, visit livestockdata.org. You can sign up to our mailing list. You can also join us for our closing session, which is today, 4 p.m. UK time. It's on Brain Date. It's going to be a friendly chat, reflections and wrap up. So we do hope to see you there. And with that, I will hand over to Peter Ballantyne, who will introduce the session. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Nice to be with you all, everybody. So my task today is going to be much easier than normal because Vanessa's doing all the hard work. So I'm Peter Ballantyne and I work with Jameel Observatory as well as some other organizations that are partners with the Jameel Observatory. So my task now really is mainly just to introduce the agenda for the next 90 minutes or so. But what I'd like to do maybe is to already ask you to introduce yourself in the chat. I would like to, I'm just dropping in now, if you could maybe type in your affiliations while I'm talking and maybe tell us something about why livestock matters in drylands. That's what the focus of today is all about. So I've just put it in the chat. If you could introduce yourselves and tell us about what you see as the important roles that livestock play in drylands. So we're going to do a short intros now, a little bit of a process introduction. Duncan is going to explain a little bit, introduce the Jameel Observatory actually, so you better understand what this thing is. It's quite a new entity. And then Guyo Roba, he's now the head of the observatory based in Nairobi. He's going to frame the conversation by talking a little bit about the importance of livestock and livestock data in relation to early action against climate and environmental shocks, which is really the focus of today. So it's a bit of a humanitarian space overlapping with development. So we wanted to just kind of put that in context. And then Rupsha Banerjee, who is from ILRI, one of the partners in the observatory, she will then give us, I think you will use some slides, and then Rupsha is going to give us a bit of an oral presentation talking about some of the risk reduction and resilience work ILRI has been doing in East Africa and looking at the data dimensions of that. So while we're talking about data, we want to really keep in mind that the focus, we're talking about early action, we're talking about early warning, we're talking about resilience against climate shocks, and the immediate kind of focus point very much is the ongoing drought in East Africa that's now entering its fourth or even fifth year. We're going to break into two groups. We'll have some light conversation and we're going to do some quick feedback. And then we're going to ask Gary Watmo, have I pronounced your name right? Watmo, Gary, from the University of Edinburgh. He works in the School of Geosciences. So it comes at it from a completely different data dimension rather than a livestock dimension. And then we'll do a quick wrap up at the end. So I don't know whether people are introducing themselves on the chat. I'm seeing a few folks. Francis is there. I'm seeing Gary, great. Bruno, super, Alan. So everybody, if you could just give us a word on just introduce yourself so we know who we are, and you all know who everybody is. And if you can really think about that question I was asking, why livestock matter in dryland.
3, 2, 1. Okay. That's it. 90% response rate. That's not bad.
We're up to 90%. That's pretty good.
All right.
So it looks like we have. What do we have? Yeah. What are you seeing, Vanessa, in terms of who we are, expertise?
Yeah. So we're well split. We have about 48% minimal understanding, 44% substantial understanding. Obviously, there's not a lot of middle ground between that. Nobody has enormous understanding, so that's good. So we all have something to learn. and a handful of people, 2 people, are coming to this very fresh, so ready to.
My name's Duncan. I'm by trade a livestock nutrition specialist, but I'm interested generally in livestock systems. I work both at the University of Edinburgh and the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Systems, and also at the International Livestock Research Institute. And I lead the Jameel Observatory for Edinburgh, although Guyo Roba, who's also on the call, is the head of the observatory and sits at ILRI in Nairobi. So just to give you a little bit of background on this Jameel Observatory for Food Security Early Action, maybe good to start with the overall vision, which is that through early action, forecasting and preparedness, vulnerable pastoral and agripastoral communities in East Africa are food and nutrition secure in the face of climate change now and in the future. So that's what we're aiming at. The opportunity is that with advances in Earth observation, data science, digital technologies, and applications, there is an opportunity to bring those things to bear in this early warning, early action space, and to apply them in real life decision-making situations with potential to achieve outcomes in terms of improved well-being and livelihoods of pastoral communities. And it's also about mobilizing research, but not just blue skies, ivory towers research, but applied research, which builds on the capabilities in the region in terms of research capabilities, and also engages heavily with end users, as you'll see as I move on through this presentation. So what are we? We're as I said, the Jameel Observatory for Food Security Action, Early Action. We're essentially a consortium of partners with complementary capabilities that we bring to bear to this issue. And we see ourselves as what we might call an innovation lab. So it's about stimulating research and action based on expressed local needs. The consortium is led by the University of Edinburgh. We've also got significant expertise in Earth observation, data science, and digital education. The International Livestock Research Institute, with headquarters in the region in Nairobi, has a wealth of experience in applied livestock and climate change research in dryland and pastoral areas, and acts as our presence in East Africa. Save the Children are a humanitarian NGO, global NGO, but with very strong presence in East Africa, have developed various methods and tools around early warning, early action, including forecast-based action approaches and tools. JPAL, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, are our evaluation partner. They work in generating evidence for policy and are world leading in terms of robust assessments of development interventions. And Community Jameel, our main investor, and they also have an excellent network that helps us with our sort of influencing function. The core model of the observatory is centered around a community of practice, which we established late last year through a virtual meeting, and then in April through an in-person meeting in Nairobi, where we brought together all the main players in this space, well, certainly a large proportion of them, and had a very fruitful meeting in terms of teasing out some of the issues, the current issues in this area. The idea is that community of practice through dialogue generates a series of what we call challenge questions, gaps in research for action that we can address. They undergo a process of prioritization, which is something we're busy with at the moment. We then re-engage with the wider network and commission a series of research projects, either through PhD students, postdocs, or through short consortium projects. We're in the process of that at the moment. And over time, that research re-interfaces with the community of practice to ensure that it's grounded in practice and is part of a learning cycle, with the aim of developing options and solutions for impact. So that's the kind of core model of the Jameel Observatory. We've been going around a year. Just a few early milestones. We've recruited Dr. Guyo Roba as the head of the observatory. He's going to talk to us in a moment. We're ongoing in our recruitment of PhD students. We have 3 started already and 1 starting early in 2023. We're also funding a couple of joint postdoc positions with a sister project called Spark in East Africa. We've commissioned a small project led by the Center for Humanitarian Change in Kenya to track decision making in response to triggers and warnings that have been coming out over the last couple of years as part of the current unfolding crisis in the Horn of Africa. We've developed a small collaboration with the Data for Children Collaborative, looking at seasonality issues as applied to nutritional surveys. And as I mentioned, we had our in-person community of practice meeting in Nairobi in April. That should be April 22, actually. And we're also running and will run a series of virtual mini dialogues with key stakeholders to tease out some of these issues. And we've been submitting various funding proposals, including one this morning, actually. So that's where you can find us, the jameelobservatory.org. And so hopefully that gives you a flavor of what we're about. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot,
much,
Alan.
You go ahead, Vanessa.
No, that's all I had to say.
Oh, okay. We're just thanking Alan. So one of the nice things about today is we have the two kind of driving spirits in the observatory together on one call. So Alan has been involved from the very beginning from the Edinburgh side, and Guyo Roba joined the observatory in April this year, right before that observatory meeting. So he's the driver on the ground. And so what we want to do is to kind of frame our conversation today. So like I said, we're trying to have that conversation around what are some of the research and collaboration opportunities in this space. But Guyo is going to kick us off by explaining a bit why we actually have these questions around livestock and where the potential, where we are in terms of livestock data. So Guyo, over to you. I think Vanessa's going to run the slides for you, but maybe you should be on our screens rather than Alan. Guyo.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Very well.
All right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Guyo Roba. I am the head of Jameel Observatory. I am based in Nairobi, and I will speak to a few slides on livestock and early action against climate shock. So welcome. I think just move to the next slide. Yeah, I think before I start my presentation, I want to go into few slides, just few points on why livestock is important in the face of climate shock. And it's very important to understand that the production environment, which is dryland area, is a heterogeneous landscape with patchy resources, and because of that, I think the common mode and the most feasible mode of production is livestock production, extensive livestock production or pastoralism. And importantly, I think this is so because the livestock forms an important asset for the rural vulnerable communities because it's a convertible liquid asset on the hooves for that purpose. So in most areas, I think we have different type or species of animals, some quickly convertible, others take a bit of decision process to convert, depending on the size, from small ruminants to the big ruminants. But then all of them have very important role in the household income. Secondly, I think is a store of wealth. Basically, I think historically, livestock keepers, particularly pastoralists, are considered to be people who are mystically attached to their livestock and they don't want to dispose them off. But then there are reasons and there's rationale always for why people do that. And one, I think, is the store of wealth, collateral in times of needs, a very important safety net when you need them and when you want to convert them. Overall, I think it's very important to understand the contribution of livestock in terms of the product, milk, meat, to nutrition and food security. of the household, and also a very important contributor to the, to the national economy through the contribution to GDP. And indirectly, I think because of its link to the, agricultural production system, especially in agro-pastoral systems, livestock plays a very important role as a contributor of very essential manure, nutrients, and animal traction to contribute to the, contribution of crop yield and production. I think overall, in the face of the climate change, the livestock asset becomes a very important buffer against climate and other shocks that is very commonplace in dryland area. So as such, I think livestock data becomes very important important input for, development planning, investment planning, and also for drought monitoring in our context. Next slide, please. So before I go to the depth of my conversation on, holding down to livestock data, I think it's very important to understand the approaches for drought monitoring varies from place to place. And I think depending on the quality of data availability in different states, could be fragile state, could be established, stable states, institutional established. So some context people use single index or parameters to, project drought, drought information. In other cases, they use multiple indices or combination of parameters, climate, vegetation, soil moisture, and others, to bring together what we call composite index, as you can see in the slide, where you pull together climatic, rainfall, temperature data, vegetation condition, forage condition, soil moisture as an important, variable, and then together, I think it gives you the composite index that gives you the, drought situation from normal, to moderate, severe, extreme to an exceptionally, emergency drought situation. Next, please. Yeah, I think the variables, this is not exhaustive, but just to give you a quick run through some of the variables that is used commonly for drought monitoring for early warning systems. Climate data becomes very important. I think, as I mentioned, precipitation, temperature, etc., becomes a very important input to drought monitoring. Soil moisture is another one where it possibly could be measured depending on the capability of institutions to measure that. Water is another important variable, both groundwater availability, level, stream flow, and other attributes that people use in the in water space. Of course, short, medium, and long-term weather forecast also gives you drought situation in the emerging days or months. Vegetation condition become very important the factor where they look at vegetation health and stress level to provide some indication of vegetation condition, and that I think sometimes people use subjective attribute, but also mostly precisely now with advance in computing, people use remote sensing products to show the both spatial and high resolution data of vegetation change. Closer to our topic on livestock, I think socioeconomic data, however difficult it is to pull together, however the qualities vary, contrasting data in that space. We also collect, production data around livestock, agriculture, nutrition status, poverty index, and child malnutrition, and etc. All this becomes very important socioeconomic data that gives us the picture, that completes the picture. But I think I have to emphasize that still this part of socioeconomic data is evolving in most countries and in most regions, depending on the quality of the survey, is still very weak. And I will speak to this in my next slide on the livestock. Excellent, thank you. So the livestock indicators, as I think in most of the drought bulletin and drought products that the products that you use for pulling together climate information, it's fairly subjective. The first one is the livestock body condition, where different countries, different institutions use different attributes from losing weight, gaining weight, maintaining weight, to deteriorating or very poor body weight of animals, livestock productivity, the milk yield, and other products that come from livestock, depending on which species is being monitored in a drought situation. Mortality is another important one that is always captured as one of the data that is related to drought. But then additionally, we also look at the grazing and water condition for livestock, where I think in quite a few countries, it's captured in also, again, subjective term from, perception, very poor, bare ground, declining from poor to very poor, or fair poor. So those are the attributes that defines them. And experience from different countries shows that whatever data one can place their hand on, they pull together to form what you call this livestock index as one of the indicator or one of the variables that complement other existing variables on climate and others that I've already walked through. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think just to push that livestock data point home, I pulled together some of the information from the National Drought Management Authority drought bulletin that is monthly produced in Kenya. And on the left, I wanted to show some of this is just for one of the county, but I think I saw they considerably vary in some context on kind of information they collect, both biophysical indicators, socioeconomic indicators. So by biophysical indicators, largely is the rainfall condition, whether it's normal, below normal, above normal. Vegetation also become very important biophysical indicator. Greenness condition as below, normal average, as you can see in this example of Taita Taveta County in Kenya. Then I think back to my point in socioeconomic data, which is basically the impact indicators, crop in the field, condition as poor, withering due to moisture stress. Also for livestock, the same thing I already said. Body condition as good, while good to fair. These subjective variables are always used. Average milk production per household per day, or milk consumption per household per day is also used. And then, of course, there are other complementary indicators around access indicators in terms of trade, milk consumption per household, household return, distance to the water source, distance to water source from grazing areas, as normal, below normal, above normal. And then utilization indicators, basically looking at the proportion of children at risk from malnutrition. But then when you look at I pulled together, this is quite massive data that they use to give an overall picture of drought situation as normal, going from from alert to alarm, and then sort of emergency situation. So when you look at the right-hand side, where I pulled together just 3 counties to show the livestock data, I think body condition, although collected in different ways, is a constant thing that all the drought bulletin contains. Livestock migration pattern, direction of migration, whether it's out migrating, in migrating. Milk production is constant across the bulletins. And then livestock deaths attributed to the drought situation or heat stress is very common. So they vary, but I think I can, in my next slide, I can give impression of what this data says about the quality of livestock data. Next slide. Yeah, my quick reflection on this NDMA data, it shows basically the subjectivity of livestock data. So it's basically interpretation of whoever answers your question from a given area. It also shows discrepancy on the key values to measure body condition. And then, of course, migration also has different value used by different county. But I think what is key out of this is that we haven't reached a point where we can actually pull together and have a composite index to bring livestock data into one frame, saying that when all this information fitted in this is what the situation is like. And I think it's quite a good job to pull this socioeconomic data in a very subjective way, but then there is always room and need for improvement to improve the accuracy of this data, to improve the meaning or usefulness of this data, and any attributes that one collects around livestock. Next, please. Yeah, so my next slide is more the last slide on data limitation. I think because of the subjectivity of a frame with which livestock data are collected, I think the accuracy and timeliness of this data, and it's very subjective to whoever gives you this information and how this information are pulled together to give a picture. And then, of course, depending on the type of drought, especially for agricultural and hydrological droughts, the affected crops and livestock data, condition, yield, growth stage, this still has some work to do. The other limitation is, I think, is remote sense data, depending on the resolution level, how much exists in terms of the quality of Earth observation. This still present a bit of data limitation. Of course, I think as NDVI sometimes, as an ecologist, I could say in dryland, greenness does not always translate to quality. There is the grazing potential of particular species that cannot be captured through the NDVI. That user perspective is always required, but I think we don't have opportunity or facility or resources to collect this user information to complement the NDVI data. Vulnerability and impact data, I think this requires a bit of crunching and interpretation, but it still is limited, although in some places the impact data are quite explicitly stated, but I think there is a bit of limitation. I think the last one is the mechanisms for communicating this subjective early warning information to users. I think generally within our space, the information, analysis of information, production of a product is slightly, far away from the users. And I think that dissemination link is always missing. And I think more so for, the subjective early warning information that come from the user, it's a good way of integrating this information into our existing, data or indicators that we collect in climate, soil moisture, etc. I think this is not exhaustive, but I'll stop here and I'll take it back to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guyo. It's interesting that, we always think of data as being very precise and accurate and correct, but in fact, you use the word subjective quite a few times there and qualitative. So anyway, if you have comments and questions and reactions, we hope you can bring them with us when we go into our breakout groups. But also, if you want to post something on the chat, if there's something there you want to have a conversation, please already do that. We wanted to complement Guyo's presentation with our colleague Rupsha Banerjee from ILRI. And Rupsha, I know you've been trying to find a way to turn your video on, but if you haven't managed, I hope I know we were able to hear you, and you've been involved with this project that ILRI and partners have been doing for many years, the index-based livestock insurance. Ah, yes, we see you nice and bright. And
yeah, I'm on my phone.
Okay, you moved to the mobile environment. Okay, and you've also been heavily involved in recent years, I think, much more in kind of risk-based approaches to kind of helping people kind of deal with shocks and threats. So we're hoping that you can share 5 to 7 minutes or so, give us a bit of an additional perspective, tell us some, kind of complement what we've heard from Guyo. So I'd like to hand it over to you if you can, and then after that we're going to break into some groups. So again, if you have comments, questions for Rupsha or Guyo, just please feel free to drop them into the chat as we move along. Over to you, Rupsha.
Yeah, okay, thanks Peter, and thanks Guyo for setting a very good scene. So I don't have a presentation, but I think I will just talk, because I think a lot of the technical aspects on data Guyo has kind of covered in his presentation. So I'm mainly associated, and I lead a team which is now working on drought risk financing solutions, which most people over here may have known as the index-based livestock insurance. Why we call it drought risk financing solutions right now, because it has significantly evolved from how it started to where it is now. And in addition to that, we are also working on collecting high frequency data. Why this is important to mention is that because one of the reasons why the livestock insurance program is also significant, besides being one of the few programs that was launched in Kenya and Ethiopia for ensuring pastoralists in the drylands. When the program started, actually, one of the biggest struggles that we actually had was to get data. It was extremely difficult, and as a result of which we had to set up a panel data to collect some of the household indicators related to livestock, because otherwise there was no way of really understanding whether this kind of a financial tool or a product has any kind of impact on the drylands system. And like Guyo mentioned, that some of the data that we actually and some of the indicators that he showed was some of the indicators that we have been also collecting for about 7 rounds in Marsabit County and about 6 rounds in southern Ethiopian region, where both these places where the livestock insurance program was actually launched. And what this helped us basically was to understand actually the effects of introducing some kind of like a financial tool or a financial access mechanism on the livelihood and the welfare of the pastoralists. So why I mention this is that because there are fundamentally 2 issues that in the drylands, one of the biggest concerns and one of the biggest dearth is basically the availability of data. Like Guyo mentioned, that of course NDMA is one of the institutions that has been collecting data for a long period of time, but the reality also remains is that there are several challenges attached to that as well. And one of them, which he mentioned, was that it is subjective in the sense that it depends on who you're asking. And secondly, sometimes there is also issues around data quality. So that's why, and also by virtue of the fact that the drylands are considered to be relatively remote, people don't want to invest in data collection or in terms of to get data which is both quality as well as both accurate, and there is a need to do that. As in, if you give the example right now of the unprecedented drought that is happening in the Horn of Africa, I think a lot of the early action mechanisms or a lot of the early interventions would have been possible, or there could have been some early actions taken if we had enough data and some reliable data on the trends and the forecasts that were happening. So therefore there is a need to do that. And related to livestock, it is not just excuse me, it's not just restricted to the livestock body condition. Of course, they are one of the indicators, but also in terms of the milk production, in terms of the nutrition that the family is having, and also the products and the market conditions. Basically, market conditions can actually be a very good proxy to understand what is happening in that area, not only in terms of seasonality, but also in terms of other incidents that are happening, such as conflicts, maybe a disease outbreak, so on and so forth. So therefore, in relation to that, as we were implementing ILRI, the index-based livestock insurance, we came across this big challenge of actually not having enough information on what's going on in the drylands, in the market system, and essentially even to understand that how are people even operating as far as payouts and livestock markets and so on and so forth are concerned. So therefore, in order to complement the traditional mechanisms of collecting data, we launched a mobile platform where basically using the pastoral community members themselves, we started collecting high frequency data on a weekly basis on market prices, on livestock body condition, market operating status, and on essential commodities. Over the years, this has basically transformed into what we now call as the Sentinel sites, which is basically been set up in Marsabit County and in Ethiopia and in the southern Borana region. And the idea is basically to have like a 2.0 version of having a panel to the traditional panel data that is already existing. We are not saying in any way that the traditional mechanisms of collecting data is redundant. They have their own uses, and to a certain extent, they're still extremely useful for impact assessment over a long period of time, and for even understanding behavioral change. But such kind of high frequency data actually enable, especially in complex environments, it actually enables you to have like understanding of how things are changing and moving in this extremely dynamic space, and also to basically to think about like what are some of the actions or early warnings that can be actually worked with other institutions to do so. We also collect data on rangelands, and that basically again goes back to what Guyo was saying, that like instruments such as remote sensing or NDVI have their own limitations when it comes to the greenness of certain animal species and so on and so forth, and also regularly understanding what is going on in the rangelands in terms of the changing the changing agroecological patterns or the land patterns and so on and so forth. So such kind of data collection by the community members themselves not only enables them to participate in the process, but also helps us to have a ground truthing mechanism, especially when we're talking about things like financial tools such as livestock insurance, which mainly depend on the pasture availability and the pasture content. So overall, what I would say in conclusion is the fact that mechanisms of data collection in using citizen science and using mobile phones is not a myth anymore. It is something that can be done in the pastoral communities. It needs investment, especially because it is as good quality data as you can get, because it is possible to get such kind of data from the communities themselves. They themselves use this data to make their own decisions, and it can also help in several areas such as detecting nutrition, malnutrition, seeing the linkages between forage availability and milk production, so on and so forth, on a large scale, which can help both at the policy level, but also in determining some early action in the event of drought situations or any other natural or human-made or human-induced disasters. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Rupsha. That was excellent. What was very interesting was the nice complementarities you brought. You emphasized the kind of the role of the market in a sense as this proxy, and the important role of markets. We talked a little bit, I think, about how the communities themselves have a really important role in this, and they have their own early warning systems. And I think, I mean, Guyo is himself from a pastoral background, so he often tells interesting anecdotes about their measures and their data, which are quite different to some of the measures we typically use in science. And I guess the third dimension there was all that, the digital revolution, the digital opportunities. Good, that's what these are kind of allowing us to do things differently. So good, that was all food for conversation, food for discussion. What we would like to do now is to break everybody up into two groups. And what we're going to do, and we're going to have one group, we're going to have Rupsha and Alan. And Alan, I'm hoping that you will take on the facilitating role. Rupsha would be our resource person. In the other group, we would have Guyo as the resource person, and Gary from the University of Edinburgh as our kind of facilitator. And we have two big questions for you. You can see them on the screen. And what we're trying to do, and in a sense, this is linking a bit to this ongoing mini dialogues that Alan has been talking about. I mean, this issue of livestock itself, and also livestock data, is really a critical area for the Jameel Observatory. So what we like to do is for you to talk about two things. And the first one really is, where and how can this type of data, like we called it here livestock associated, because it's data about the animals, but it's also the systems in which they're being produced, but it's also the environments and the people and the market. So, you know, where and how can this data make the most difference if we're thinking about reinforcing and guiding early action or early warning against climate shocks, you know, and how we prepare ourselves and how we adapt and how we can respond. So the thing is, have a conversation, and perhaps we want to tease out that a little bit. And then what we're wanting to draw from it, if you can, is the second question. Are there some specific research or communication or other collaborative actions that you think we could take forward, you know, that would really be worth investing in, worth talking a bit more about, you know, to enhance livestock data or its use? And we're interested in both. I mean, I think Rupsha talked quite a lot, and I think Guyo did also, about the actual data itself, the quality of it, but also how it's being used, who is using it. I think Guyo talked about, you know, there's no kind of one space where you get a kind of a composite view that could guide decision-making or something like that. So those are the two questions. Welcome back, everybody. We hope you had some good discussions. Time always goes very quickly in these small groups. but we hope you made some progress. What I'm going to do is in a couple of minutes, I'm just going to give some people reminders and warnings. I'm going to ask Guyo and Rupsha to give us a quick feedback from each of the groups. What I'd like to do is, while they are thinking what they want to say, if you could maybe take a look at the chat, if you share, is there a lesson, an insight, a takeaway that any one of you have picked from these conversations in the last, whatever it was, 20, 25 minutes or earlier this afternoon. But when we're compiling the report, it's always nice to, because we may not catch everybody's thoughts. So if there's a lesson or a takeaway, if you could drop that into the chat, that would be really, really helpful. So then I'm going to ask Rupsha and Guyo to give us a little bit of a feedback. And then after that, I'm hoping that Carrie will give us a data guru perspective, and then Alan can maybe wrap us up. I'm not seeing anybody replying on my chat, so maybe I'll give you another half a minute to think. There must be something. It can be an insight, a takeaway, a question. Thank you, Alan. That's always good. Let's be smart with our collecting. Yeah. So anybody else, any reflection or a thought from anything you talked about, anything you heard, a question maybe that you had that wasn't answered, or that you want to, somebody else's question that you want to answer, that would be great. We're down to, we're around 30 people or something, 25 people. So I would love to get like 10 small pieces of feedback. And in that time, I'm hoping that Rupsha and Guyo can get their thoughts in order. I can see some friends here from the Jameel Observatory community, people who are not necessarily in the livestock space. So we're hoping you got some different perspectives to bring, but also you to take away. Anybody else? Bruno, thanks. Let's see, AI, okay, spatial data. Yeah, this whole AI thing is a very popular topic these days. That would be an interesting one to be thinking a little bit more about, yeah. So AI, smarter collection of data, AI to better predict what's going to happen. Any more? If you give a couple more thoughts, any takeaway points from Gary? Who are the decision makers? Yeah. Yeah, the pastoralists themselves, of course, that's certainly one of the groups, but there may be, we always assume with all this early warning stuff that we're trying to persuade governments and people like that. Yeah, and donors and people with money in their pockets. There's Simon coming in. Okay, yes, that's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, knowing where people are and how to reach them, that's pretty critical. That's a whole digital element. Oh, radio, yeah. Yeah. I assume, I mean, in the old days, people on radio was a really important way of warning people about things happening. So I guess that can come back. Yeah, the clusters notion is challenging. Any more? Aha, Gary, so we can ignore government and NGOs. Aha, let's see. That's an interesting discussion point. A couple more points, anybody? And then we're going to hand over. I would like to go maybe to Guyo and Rupsha. Let's just take another half a minute. Any other thoughts? Any other takeaways you have? Questions, takeaways, reflections? Somebody else has just posted. Let's see, Liz, yeah. But die from pasture long before the lack of water. That's okay. That's something for the, I don't know whether John, some of the people who are here, the livestock, the animal guys are still here. Yeah, livestock, lack of pasture. Okay, so we need to have that. The implication then is it's the pasture indicators are more important than the water indicators, perhaps. Okay, let's keep on going. I'm going to take one more comment and then we can move. So if you're there, please give us. Alex, see Alexis there. Nelly, maybe Nelly has a thought from a different perspective. Anybody else? The British Prime Minister recently gave some radio interviews where she had long silences and people got worried about them. So I'm going to give you a long silence now until one more, somebody else posed a reflection. There must be something we can take from it.
Peter, I thought it was better that she didn't speak and then the markets didn't collapse.
Okay, that's an interesting. There's some causative action there, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of points coming in here. That's good. I can see that that looks like Jeff. Better automated prediction of the numbers and carrying. Yeah. Okay. And Bruno, thanks. Conflict mitigation. Good. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to ask maybe Rupsha, can you give us, from your group discussion, are you able to give us a couple of points that came up that struck you on any of the questions?
Yeah, so we managed to actually just do the first one, and then after that I was kicked out. So I'm not sure whether Alan got to the second one, but some of the main things that came out was use of tracking devices to record livestock movement, and this was part of an example that was given for a project in Mali. Because, and what the interesting thing was that there were actually some useful insights from differences between when animals went grazing with children versus with adults. So I think that was pretty cool. There was another point on that, irrespective of big projects like ARC and other institutions coming into some kind of an anticipatory or early action, there is a lack of consolidated data capacity as well as data availability. So the idea was that how can you actually make use of what is there to currently for extrapolation. So that could be in the medium term, before we find innovative ways of collecting data, how can we make best use of the data that is already there. And the example was from Somalia, and I think one of the points that was pretty critical was the use of indigenous knowledge, and not ignoring that indigenous knowledge from the farmers and the herders themselves, and how it can actually be combined with the scientific knowledge, and which actually then has a lot more potential to inform early action. Because the truth of the matter is that the herders and the small farmers are adopting, and they do have their own mechanisms to deal with what is to come, and their understanding of what is to come. Yeah. So in very brief, these were the main points that came out. Thank you.
Thanks, Rupsha. Alan, did you guys come up with some magic conversations while Rupsha was kicked out?
No, actually, I forgot that there was 2 questions, so I only focused on one. But anyway, we had some nice conversations, so that was fine.
Okay, no problem. Okay, let's hop across. If anybody has extra comments and things you want to drop in the chat, please do. Guyo, from your group, can you give us a bit of a reflection? What happened? What did you do?
Yeah, I think no, we also spent a lot of time on the first question. We didn't go to the second, where you wanted some collaboration. Yeah, I think 2 things. First, I think from the beginning of our conversation, the question of what, more than where and how came up. What data, what is important in a given context came up, and I think as put in the chat already, the carrying capacity question on how do we actually with innovation and advance in computing and earth observation, how do we actually precisely predict this for the carrying capacity versus the number of animals that we have, so that we cross-check with the forage that is available, so that we can plan for a drought response, early action. But I think the other critical question that came up is the question of in the what is it important to collect information on the livestock condition, the pasture, or the water? And I think that's where the point in the chat came up, where I think pasture is more critical than the water. And I think this is purely debatable, because I think they almost both go hand in hand, but I think it's very important in my own understanding and knowledge. How do you bring the 2 together? I think in most of our dry areas, where I come from in Marsabit, the landscape level view shows that I think there are many places where we have mismatch between water and pasture, where I think animals leave an area because of lack of access to water, and then you have a standing pasture after season. And somehow I think because of our planning issue and mapping and etc., we are unable to fix that. And I think that is tied to the first question. But I think all in all, I think what is quite important is the practicality of getting the data. How do we pull this together periodically if some of these data have to be pulled together. So there are few, I think people gave more points on the first, but I didn't. Those 2 somehow captured my imagination. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Guyo. Okay, since we didn't really get to the second question so much, I'm going to drop in the chat. Maybe let's take a half a minute. Is there a collaborative action or idea that you think worth pursuing? If you could drop it in the chat, I'd just drop there. If you have a magic idea we've heard about, I mean, Bruno, we've heard some suggestions about lessons and insights. Is there, I mean, is it something you think, this is a natural, here's something that we could really work on? And I'm taken by some of the, we have a mix of people here. We have people from the humanitarian early action space and from the data space, but also from the kind of the animal space. So it's quite an interesting mix. So if there's something you see, could you just drop it in the chat? And while you are doing that, I will ask Gary to give us some data guru type perspectives. When we were together in Nairobi, he told me he didn't know much about livestock. So Gary, over to you. Can you give us a couple of minutes reflections on this afternoon? What from your perspective?
Yeah, I think with the data, I think it's, you know, a lot of the data that's mentioned, discussed, it's all kind of, a lot of it sounds like it's already there, that it does exist. It's more what we do with it. So I think converting that data is quite important. But when I say convert, it's more converting it into information. So it's not really about the data. The data is quite good quality, and a lot of times it's more what we do with it, how we convince people that this is useful and will inspire actions and early actions. I think we then lead into issues around the trust, which I think, was it Beth mentioned in our group? The trust in the actual data and the information that you're feeding through then is key, which comes back to what we were talking about when we were in Nairobi as well. I think one of the things then that comes up is this, I think Bruno mentioned it as well, is what, you know, the information going to decision makers at the field level, the pastoralists that are already there, telling them that there's no grass and grazing available is not really helpful. That's, you know, they know that, they're in the middle of it, they know that what's going on at the time. So it's more that short to medium range forecasting as well. So that's important to get that across and communicate that with individual pastoralists and people that are herding their livestock around. Probably more so than getting it to NGO government decision makers, I think as well is going to be crucial there. And then that obviously feeds into things like insurance and all the other layers that we've been talking about with water and grazing capacities and things. So there's a lot of this information there. I think one thing that comes out though is the assumption that estimating livestock could be relatively easy. It's one of those problems that, from a remote sensing perspective, is actually a lot trickier than it first appears. It's taking a lot longer. There's a lot cleverer people than me been looking at it for a lot longer, and it's still not an easy thing to do. I think partly because too much movement of livestock, you know, they tend not to stand still very long, so it's quite difficult to come up with accurate estimations of individual livestock, at least. So there's some work there to be thinking about into the future. I don't think there was much else. I think that was about it that I came up with from the data perspective. I think a lot of the data exists. It's more just how good it is, figuring out what we do with it into the future, how we communicate it and visualize it. I think would be a key point there to inspire that actions.
Okay, there's a couple of points in the chat. I can see Bruno talking about partnerships with NASA, and then Alan is talking about scraping social media. Any thoughts on your side, or anybody actually upon those ones? I mean, are they
social media that similar to the text messages, radios? We spoke a lot about that. I think that having that a two-way flow of information as well. So and not just communicating these things with communities through radio or TV, but having that opportunity to take information from communities and feed that information back in various different ways. I think we spoke about people having lots of smartphone accessibility in Asia that's less so potentially in parts of Africa, but I don't think focusing on one platform is probably the right way to do it. It's probably multiple platforms will ensure there's more communication and sharing of that data. Yeah, social media would be good, but I think tend to think with the social media metrics for reality that we're possibly we're probably capturing a small group of people in some of these rural communities on social media, so we'd have to think about that quite carefully. NASA, not sure. They don't have high resolution data. We'd have to go proprietary So we'd have to be going to people like Maxar, where we're buying the data from them to really get detailed information on cattle. We'd need to be looking at much finer spatial resolution for satellite data at least. Certainly helps if we can have GPS tracking collars on the livestock. That would be really helpful. That would be lovely.
Okay, and a couple more chats. We're going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes. So Rupsha is telling us that because radio, reinforcing the radio message, and thanks for Beth here. Yeah, the pastoralists do know the number. But okay, they'll only share those numbers if there's really a trustworthy platform. You know, yeah, okay, that's a really important point. I think this whole trust issue. Good, and I think we're going to be close to wrapping up here. Thanks very much, Gary, for those reflections and thoughts. Alan, do you want to say some concluding remarks? I wasn't sure whether, Guyo, do you want to come in again? Yeah, Rupsha's talking about, okay, there's a few ideas here dropping in now for collaboration. Yeah, okay, yeah, we're seeing some collaboration ideas. Alan, why don't you, can you kind of wrap us up a little bit? We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for engaging. And I think we had some nice conversations. I mean, some of the things that struck me were that, you know, as scientists, certainly from the University of Edinburgh, we're the first to admit that science data is not everything. And I think we've seen this morning, you know, it's expensive to collect, it's hard to get coverage, and it doesn't always give the whole picture. So there's a whole other dimension around the human side of data that we need to think about. So what does that mean in terms of solutions? Well, I guess it means something around combining hard and what we might call hard and soft data to come closer to the truth. And then, as Gary says, thinking about data use. So it's not just about generating the data, but it's how the data is used and how to turn it into products which are useful and can aid decision making. So that might involve a bit of thinking around co-creation of data products rather than them simply being generated in science environments. So adjusting data products so that you know, based on feedback from end users, and not just from pastoralists, but from higher level end users as well. So government, policymakers, development, NGOs, and those kind of people. Those are just a few kind of thoughts off the top of my head.
I need to unmute. Thanks very much, Alan. So I was really happy that our colleagues from Ren Media could also join us today. So that means we're going to have some good notes, I think, from the discussions, and we will wrap those all up and bring them back to you. Vanessa had said that as part of the whole LD for D community week, we will also be sharing some kind of feedback from this session. So if you want to know more, you can know more. And if you want to know more about the Jameel and these activities, you can follow up with that. I'd like to hand back over to Vanessa. So she does warn me that there's 2 small children running through her room, so it might be quite loud.
Not yet, they're in the house. Yes, I just wanted to thank Community Jameel, ILRI, Global Academy, and their collaborators very much for putting together this session, and also to everyone for the discussions, and also to thank everyone who has participated in our other sessions this week. It's been a really rich week, lots of conversations, lots of connections, so I hope that you've had a chance to check that out. We're posting recordings of all the videos. I think we've gotten up to Wednesday or Thursday now, so we have a few more videos to process. We'll circulate those as soon as we can. If you're keen to give feedback, because we want to know how this community can work best for you, their members, what you'd like to learn, what you'd like to work on together, we'll have a feedback session at 4 p.m. UK time. That's in about 35 minutes. It's on our Brain Day platform. I'll paste the link in the chat. You do need to book a place. Doesn't cost anything, just takes a moment to set up your account. So do join us there if you'd like to give us any kind of feedback or suggestions. So with that, I thank you all, and we look forward to sharing the report back.
And thanks, Vanessa, for hosting us and letting us have this conversation. That was great. Much appreciated, everybody.
And thank you, Peter, for facilitating the whole process.